Hi guys, welcome to Studio Wildlife. In today's video I'm going to show you how to paint realistic white fur. So in this video I'm going to share with you my process and some tips for painting realistic white fur. First of all, we're going to follow these 5 things to remember when we're painting realistic white fur. One is don't use pure white paint. It's very rare that you actually see pure white in real life. All the white that you use needs to be nulled down a little bit with some colours. Point 2 is look for the hidden colours within the fur. Quite often the white fur is actually quite saturated with colours underneath, such as tan, such as brown, oranges and blues. Point 3 is look for the environmental colours. So the environment actually reflects into the white fur, so you often see greens and warmer tones hidden within that fur, so make sure to look for that. Point number 4, don't be afraid to go too dark. A lot of people, when I see them painting white fur, they tend to just try and shove loads and loads of white paint on it, go really bright with their fur, and they don't have enough contrast, they don't have enough shadows there. So don't be afraid to go dark. And then finally, point 5, when painting realistic white fur, you could sort of knock back the details, focus more on the clumps of shapes, the shadows, the highlights, rather than actually looking at individual strands of fur. So that's it for my quick 5 tips. The rest of the video will show you how to use those and go into my entire process for painting an animal with white fur. I hope you enjoy the video. If you do, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get started. One of the biggest mistakes beginners make when they're trying to paint white fur is they think that white fur is just made up of black and white, but it's not. There's actually hundreds of different colours within that white fur that if you look closely enough you can actually see. And one of the things that I like to do when I'm painting a white animal is actually use technology to my advantage. So I've actually done this using the Procreate app on my iPad, but you could do it on Microsoft Paint, you could do it on Microsoft PowerPoint or Photoshop, anything that allows you to use a colour picker tool and actually drag the colours from the painting onto a white background. So you can actually see that these colours aren't white, and you can see that there are actually quite saturated browns and blues and greens and yellows hidden within this fur. Let's do the same thing with a tiger picture, because as you know, tigers are my favourite animal to paint, and what better than this white tiger here. So you can see that in the shadows and in the highlights we've got lots and lots of different colours. There's a really dark green section underneath the tiger's chin where the lights and the colours from the environment surrounding that tiger have been reflected in that white fur. So we need to be looking at those colours and studying those colours efficiently and effectively as we're painting. This process can even be applied to pets. So here is a little white dog, and again I've just done the same thing. I've just picked the colours using the colour picker tool of the areas of the fur that I sort of identify as being the most important. So the areas of shadows, the areas of highlights, and the mid-tone areas in between. I can actually do this by sight now, so I don't need to do this colour picker tool because I've done it so many times that I'm practiced and I can actually visualise those colours using that reference photo much more clearly when I'm actually painting. As I was just starting out, I used this technique for nearly all of my paintings, regardless of whether it was white fur or brown fur or yellow fur or orange fur, whatever fur it was. I used this technique of picking out the colours that I needed just to help me visualise them a little bit better. So for this demonstration I'm going to be using this picture of the dog. I'm not going to be painting the whole dog, I'm just going to be picking a small section of its fur. I've actually got this dog reference from Pixabay, so you can actually use this yourselves as well. When I'm painting animals with white fur, I like to actually use 3 reference photos. The first is my original reference photo, and that is the main photo that I will rely on when I'm actually painting. But I will also do 2 edits. This can be done on Photoshop, it can be done on your phone, it can be done on Microsoft PowerPoint, anything. But all I'm doing is firstly increasing the saturation in one image, and this is there to enable me to see where those bright saturated colours are in a little bit more detail, and I know exactly where to put my colours when I come round to painting those coloured layers. I have a third photograph, which is a photo that I increase the contrast, and that is so I can clearly view the shapes and the structures, the shadows and the highlights, so that when I'm actually blocking in my painting, I get those forms and proportions correct. For the majority of my painting, I will only really use that original reference photo, but if I am struggling to pick out the small colours and the slight differences in the colours in the fur, I will refer to those increased saturation photos, and if I'm struggling to find out which direction those fur strokes need to be in, I will look at that increased contrast photo. So as I said previously, we are going to be using this dog photo in this video, and I am just going to choose this close crop of its fur underneath its chest, or on its chest, just because I think there's some nice mixes of lights, some saturated colour, and I think I can create some nice fur strokes from this section of the dog. So we'll move on to my palette and what colours I would use next, but before that, if you do enjoy the video and you do find it useful, please make sure to give us a like and subscribe to the channel, because it does really help us out. So let's get started and move on to what colours I'd use. Okay, so to start, I thought I'd just very quickly show you what paints I've got on my palette. My palette is just a simple piece of glass that I've taken from an old frame and just repurposed as a glass palette. I use pretty much the same layout for all of my paintings, but for this one, I am using the Abstract range of acrylic paints. I don't know if you can see that there. I love these paints. I do find them really useful and quite good paints, and I like the pouches that they come in. But basically, I've got titanium white here. I've got a little bit of ultramarine blue, I've got some yellow ochre, I've got some burnt umber, some raw umber, and a little bit of black. The other colours that I would usually have on this palette that I'm not using today are raw sienna, buff titanium, a little bit of sap green, and occasionally a cadmium red. But that's pretty much all of the colours that I use for my wildlife paintings. So to start with, I will just very quickly block in a quick drawing with a graphite pencil. I do it with graphite because it doesn't tend to smudge very much when you are applying paint over the top. Sometimes I will use charcoal, but if I use charcoal to block in my drawing, I will actually fix it with a pastel fixative before I actually start painting, just because that stops the drawing from being smudged underneath. I'm just looking at the basic shapes and the basic structures of that fur. I'm not focusing on any detail at that stage. Once I've done that, I will then wash over that with a colour that closely resembles the background colour. So for this one, I went for a greeny blue. I actually do this just to remove some of that white, and also if I want a cooler feel to my fur, I will use a bluer background. If I want a warmer feel to that fur, I'll use a background that's a little bit browner. Once I've done that, I will start to block in my dark structures. For this, I'm just using raw umber paint mixed with a little bit of blue, and I'm just using it very thinly, and I'm just blocking in those structures where I want those shadowy areas to be, and drawing in those fur strands with a little layer of paint, just to improve that drawing underneath a little bit and provide me with some reference later on. Once I've done that, I will pick one of the colours from my reference photo, preferably a dark colour first. I always like to start dark to light, and I'm just using a bit of blue mixed with black and raw umber here, and I'm just blocking in those dark colours and dark layers. It's important to start dark so that you can build those lighter layers over the top. Once I've done that, I will just bring some slightly lighter and slightly more saturated colours into those shadowy areas, just working layer in layer, just looking at the colours that I am visualising in my reference photo and applying those colours and transferring them to the painting. Here is an important step, because I'm not just using one colour. I'm using bits of blue, I'm using bits of brown, I'm using bits of green, and I'm really studying that original reference photo and that highly saturated image to see where those colours are. Once I've got that dark base layer down, I'll start to actually paint in the strands of fur. I am just focusing on clumps of fur, and I'm just using a very mid-tone grey colour. This grey, I've not just mixed black with white, I've mixed a little bit of burnt umber, a little bit of ultramarine blue, and a little bit of white to create this colour. And for this, I'm just blocking in the main clumps of fur. I'm not focusing on any details at this stage. just building up those clumps, looking at those structures and studying that reference photo closely. Once I've done that, I will use a slightly lighter grey. For this, I wanted to warm it up a little bit, so I added a little bit more of the burnt umber to my mix and a little bit of white. And again, I'm just studying that reference photo and looking at those clumps and just adding layer on top of layer, getting lighter each time, until I'm happy with the shapes and the structures of those big clumps of fur. I'm not focusing on detail at this stage. I'm just building up those layers, one on top of the other, getting lighter and lighter with each one. The brush I'm using is just a frayed old filbert brush. It's better to use older brushes at this stage just because they allow that little bit of variation. You don't have solid strokes and it just sort of adds a little bit more interest to the clumps of fur that you're painting. When you're doing fur like this, it is important to focus on the direction that the fur is going in and also make sure that each stroke is slightly different. You don't want them all going in exactly the same direction. You want them starting in the same place and starting in the same direction, but finishing in random curved directions. For this one, obviously I'm using a reference photo, so I'm studying that closely. Once I've got these basic structures in, I'll add a few more shadows and just increase the saturation for those colours a little bit more in those shadowy areas. So I have been adding my blues, my greens, and my sort of maroony, pinky, beigey colour for the reds. And I'm just washing that over the surface almost in a glaze-like motion. Once I've finished the glazing, I start to work back over the top with some lighter fur. Again, I'm just using a round brush, but this one's a little bit less frayed, so I can be a bit more precise with the hairs. Now I'm starting to think about those smaller clumps of hair within those larger clumps that I was painting earlier. And all I'm doing is just using gradually lighter and lighter layers. One thing that you can see here is that I am not using pure white. That is one of the biggest tips that I have for painting white fur. Do not use pure white. Look for the different subtle colours hidden within that fur rather than just using white straight out of the tube. I think this is white mixed with a little bit of yellow ochre mixed with a little bit of burnt sienna to give a warm highlight. Again, this isn't my final highlights, but I'm just building up those layers over the top of each other. So I've moved to an even lighter colour now, so I'm just adding white to my paint mix. And again, I'm looking at those strokes, but now I'm thinking more about those individual strands a little bit more. But again, I'm still using a big brush, so I'm not thinking about them in too much detail, just following the strokes, following the strands and studying that reference photo closely. Now I use one of my all-time favourite brushes, a dagger brush or a sword liner. This is when I'm thinking about the details and those true highlights. Again, this isn't pure white that I'm using, but it's very close to pure white. And I am just using watered down paint and using this dagger brush to add in those fine detailed strands of fur. This is where we're thinking about the individual strands as opposed to those clumps. This is where we can be more precise and controlled with our painting. And this doesn't necessarily have to be exactly matching that reference photo, so I've actually deviated from that reference photo a little bit, putting in some more fur and adding in some loose strokes that aren't necessarily there in the reference photo, but I just think it adds to this clump of fur. Once I've finished with those highlights, I will add in a few more shadows just by glazing over the top. If you want to learn more about how to glaze, I do have a video about glazing, so I'll put a link to that video in the description and put a little card up so that you can see it. That's pretty much all there is to the fur. To finish it off, once I've done that glazing, I will just add some final white highlights. This is where you could use pure white. I'm actually just using white mixed with a tiny little bit of red just to give it that warm tint. But it's very, very, very close to being pure white. And I'm just using it for the final highlights. Sometimes you can see how I'm using my finger just to smudge that paint back so it blends in. And then, if like me, I like to have a nice clean edge, so I've masking taped it, you can peel off your masking tape and then you're done. So here it is. I hope you found this video helpful. So you can see all the white fur, you can see all the colours hidden within that white fur. So it's not actually white, or very little pure white has actually been used. There are some dark values in there. That is one thing that people don't do when they're painting white fur, is paint those dark values. And you can see all of those hidden layers and hidden colours as we zoom in. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did and you found it useful, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. As I've said, it does mean so much to us. And as always, for more wildlife art tips, please head over to studiowildlife.com, and I'll see you next time.